Welcome, everyone. Today we are talking with Indrani Halder, the Senior Director of Population Health at Carillon Behavioral Health. Welcome, Indrani.
Thank you, Ivna.
Since we're talking about feedback, what are some of the most insightful feedback that you've received, especially when it comes to the communication and your communication skills or speaking up or the way you relate to people and communicate with people? Because that's such an important area.
Yes, I have received feedback throughout my career. I actually request feedback often because that is such a gift to receive and then be able to take what is really important from that feedback and incorporate into my future words and actions. One of the most interesting pieces of feedback that I received recently and something that has made me think deeply was from my leader, my boss. And it came about in the context of discussing certain work processes, certain people at work, just trying to deal through a difficult situation. And one of the feedback that caught me unawares was my boss telling me the impact that my words have on my audience. And it meant a lot because this is someone I respect deeply. And this person was telling me that my words mattered, that the audience, when they hear my words, they react differently when similar words are spoken by someone else. And he reminded me that I forget the impact I have on people. In the day to day work that we do, sometimes it is really easy to forget. The words that come out of our mouths have a pretty big impact. And that impact is not the words themselves, but the person telling them, the history of the person that is uttering those words. It did two things for me. It reinforced the view that I know that my boss has of me, which was a very positive one. And it also made me aware that I was thinking about things through a lens that did not align with who I was, who I needed to be in the role that I was. And I think from a leadership perspective, that was a very strong learning moment for myself. It wasn't that we spent a lot of time talking about it. My feedback, the time spent in getting that feedback was probably about a minute. But when I thought about it later, when I reflected upon it, it has made a pretty big impression. And what I took from that was in today's corporate world where we have to work with people from many different backgrounds, many different levels of experience, it is important to remember and remind ourselves each of us have a level of impact. And it is upon us to remember and respect that impact that we all create. And from that perspective, self awareness is a really important attribute that I have seen the leaders that I deeply admire all happen to have. They all know the weight their words carry, and they show up in a way where they reinforce the weight of those words. That individual feedback was probably part of a larger kind of discussion session, but it gave me a lot to think about. And as a result of that, I believe I'm a better leader.
Sometimes we don't really stop to think about the impact of our words. The more you go up in your career, the more people are looking up to you. You don't see it happening, but those eyes are on you, and there are more eyes on you, and they're taking what you say into more consideration.
Mhm.
And so, what has that awareness done and changed in terms of your communication? You said you've been increasing your self-awareness and considering more the impact of your words on other people, and it helped you be a better leader. What are some specific things that you've done or you've changed in your communication after that feedback?
The first very concrete tactic was starting to listen more and talk less. I know most of the time many of us are thinking what to respond versus really listening. And so I have actively tried to listen more, to really understand not just the words that are being spoken, but what lies behind those words, what emotions are underlying the words. No matter how technical the discussion is, there is always an emotion that the person sitting across from me is bringing to that conversation. Whether it is, let me quickly finish this and get through, or I need to move this forward and I really don't care what you think. A plethora of emotions are always behind that. Yes, we have to get the work done, but not paying attention to the emotions behind the words, not being attuned to those can seriously backfire. So I've started paying a lot more attention to that. The other tactic that I have used is actually remind myself not to speak whatever I'm thinking, to give myself like a 10-second pause and to quickly check, is this the right environment, the right time to be raising this question? Is the concern appropriate to be raising in front of this audience, or is this better for a one on one conversation? I am more of a talkative person. And so those reminders are really helpful for me because one thing they do is they help solidify relationships. And work relationships are important to me. Ultimately, what I realized was being able to read the other person's emotion helps me not only understand the person, but also have a better relationship with that person.
Those two tactics seem to work together because the more you listen and understand people's emotions, you're at a better spot to make that decision if what you have to say is appropriate for that moment, for those circumstances or not, because you've acquired some information based on your listening.
Hmm.
So I can see how those two work together at the same time. And what about when it comes to your communication backfiring? Because you said you're very communicative, you do share your thoughts, which is lovely. Most of our listeners shy away a little bit from sharing their thoughts because they're scared of their communication backfiring.
Absolutely.
And that's a concern that a lot of people have.
I have, yes. A couple of years previous to my taking a corporate role, I was in academia at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. I led my own research team. Our department was undergoing a facelift. People were being moved to different offices, being reallocated different offices, etc. In the process of that, I was approached by a colleague who was leading these efforts and was asked to leave my current office and take a different room and make that my office. That room did not have a window, and I preferred a room with a window. So I made a very simple ask if I would prefer a room with a window for my office. A couple of days later, one of my senior colleagues, who was also a mentor, called me in and we had a conversation where he made me aware that I was being perceived as a difficult person. At first, I didn't realize where all of that was coming from till I asked clarifying questions and I learned that my asking for a room with a window was perceived as being difficult. There were other things happening at the same time, and that one conversation stands out because that was the one and only time in a professional setting where I had tears in my eyes. It just blew my mind that how someone could interpret a request, not a demand, a request. I would prefer a room with a window to then be turned around and use those words to be described as being difficult. In retrospect, I learned to be more cautious about what I said and where and to whom. Not just what and where, but definitely whom can I ask for certain things or respond in a certain way versus where I have to be guarded. Definitely, that was something that backfired.
What do you think actually caused this?
I did not spend time thinking about it. By the time they got to me, a certain level of frustration had already been in place. And so it might have been just a expression of that. Beyond that, I don't think it's worth my energy to be thinking about that. It's something that happened in my past. I've moved on. But I did learn a big lesson in terms of be careful, like your words matter.
So if you're in a situation in the future where someone is asking you to move to an office without a window, what are you going to do?
I will think long and hard about remaining in that situation. A room with a view is, in some work settings, a privilege. It depends on where such a situation occurs. Lots of people have fantastic offices without windows. I think I will be a lot more aware of, is this the right environment to be making such a request? Is this the right person to be making such a request? Do I need to be careful about how I couch my request? So, a few things will definitely go through my mind because, as you see, it's a very simple event. But I remember it, I'm talking about it, I'm sharing this incident. It's made a deep impression in my mind.
Would it stop you from speaking your mind?
But I would definitely be way more thoughtful about where I speak my mind and with whom I speak my mind. Is one other thing I have really started observing is a lot of people speak their minds. They take pride in speaking their minds, but they're not speaking their minds in situations that are truly going to benefit them, especially in a work situation. Speaking your mind is a positive trait if you know when and where and in front of whom you have to do it. If anything, I have observed, especially with women who are technically very strong at what they do, they know their stuff. If such women are constantly speaking their minds, they get labeled. So there is definitely an art in knowing when, where, and how you should speak your mind. Because I have seen senior leaders, especially women, that I admire very much. And the art that I realize they have perfected is knowing when, where, and how to speak their minds. So that's definitely something I want to cultivate. I'm actively working on, and it takes a lot of practice and self discipline.
That's a really important lesson. It's not as simple as just saying whatever comes to your mind because we have thousands of thoughts that go through our head every
Yeah,
single moment and day, and we definitely don't want to share.
correct.
So I think that really distinguishes those who know, like you said, the people that you admire in certain leadership roles from maybe those that are not able to even get ahead or make themselves heard because I think they're more strategic, like you said, in how they speak their minds and how they
Correct.
communicate with an intention, not just for the sake of it. You said that you see some women sometimes are speaking, but they're not speaking up for something that's actually going to benefit them. But then when it comes to speaking up for something that's going to benefit them, a negotiation, for example, then they don't speak up. So it's being clear and intentional about what you say, how you say it, and to whom you say it.
Yes. And unless you start thinking about it, you don't realize how difficult that is. Those who do it well do it phenomenally well. You recognize that character, that attribute in a person. It takes practice, it really takes some thoughtful observation, realization, and communication is probably the number one skill we need these days. We've always needed a strong communicator. An effective communicator can make things so easy for themselves, and how they have to navigate different environments, and not just at work, not just in the professional realm, even in your private realm, in your private world, and just interacting with friends and family. Communication is the key. Growing up, my mom always reminded me of this. And it's a phrase she uses. I'm from India. I grew up in the part of India called Bengal, so we speak Bengali. And she would say, words are your best friends or your worst enemy. It depends on how you use them. Words are your best friends or your worst enemy. It depends on how you use them. I realized much later she was really teaching me your words are your instruments, your words are your weapon. So you really have to be thoughtful. Like all young people, I totally disregarded everything that you're saying because it went through one ear, came out through the other. But I have paid more attention to that. Yeah, absolutely. I've seen some of my leaders that I admire do that so well. How come I'm saying no one listening? You say everyone listens. It depends.
Yeah, there's so many subtleties, and your mom, very wise woman, knows what she was talking about. And you're right. Sometimes it takes such a long time to discover, first of all, that our words, our voice is an instrument, is a weapon, is capable of so much. Otherwise,
Yes,
it can create wars. It can be very destructive to ourselves and others.
yes.
Or
It
it
can
can
end
be
up
the
with
opposite, our dreams.
exactly the right words spoken at the right time, in the right way, to the right, person is sometimes talked about a lot more, but even with the right person, if you don't know when, how to say, things don't go as easily. And also being able to recognize that sometimes that's the other thing that started really focusing on. Is there someone else in my environment who is better able to say what needs to be said? And if my goal is to, let's say, achieve something, does it always have to be me who has to say that? Or can someone else say that for me? And there's a little bit of a subtlety there is sometimes if you recognize someone else will have better impact, it's probably wiser to give them the words and have them say those words. Then I'm using words loosely, it's not like exactly the words, but plant the idea so that they say it, they adopt it, because the impact that their words will have is probably going to be much more significant, more meaningful, more immediate, however you see it. It doesn't have to be just me saying that. My idea has to get implemented. Who can I leverage to be the voice for that idea?
Who can you leverage to be the voice for your idea, the carrier for your idea? And then, like you said, you can plant the idea, have them adopt your idea and carry forward your idea. So there you're also having to be conscious about what's most important to me here. Being known for this idea, being getting all the accolades for the idea, or actually getting the idea implemented and done.
Yeah,
And when you have that clarity and you realize how you can, and again, it gets even more complicated because now you need to know the players, you need to know how to influence, you need to have some political acumen,
yeah,
and then you can start to play that game a lot better to achieve your goals.
absolutely. And in some ways, this theme that I just put forward, you have to have crystal clarity. What do you want to accomplish in the short term and in the long term by giving your idea someone else's voice? Without that, you're right, it's very difficult. Most of us are conditioned to think of the words that come out of my mouth are my ideas, right? That makes me look like this, or that makes my perception be this way. I think most people think this way. Till I realized again, there are certain people who I have learned by observing a lot who have that confidence, who have that level of security where they don't hesitate to do that. I admire that. And so, in situations where I feel confident, I need to find a carrier, a bearer of those ideas.
That's a really great concept to think about. And it requires more understanding of what we want
Yes.
ultimately.
That part about persuasion, we're talking about our voices. There is an element here. For me to really be effective with this strategy, I need to have at least one conversation, which means I still need to find the courage, speak what needs to be spoken to the person that I want to carry my idea, right? We all do this in some way or the other in corporate environments where you want to give your leader the words that need to be shared. So you're always doing it. But I think if it's not your leader, if it's more of a peer, or if it's someone a couple of degrees separated from you, you still need to have that one conversation with that one person. And that's where your voice will still count. You have to have that level of confidence, authority, idea, openness to even approach this person. So what I said as a strategy for a broader audience still relies on that one conversation with one person.
You're not completely delegating the communication. You still own
No,
it, but you're being more strategic because you know that carrier is going to command that idea better in that room that you really want to influence. So I think that's a really great perspective. One of the other things that we've been talking about communication, are you very direct as well?
I am. And that was a feedback I received pretty early in my career. It was, as I said, I was an academic for the majority of my career. And as an academic, I led my own research team. It was important to me to be good at what I did and then be able to talk very directly about this is what I do. As a scientist, facts, figures, numbers, these are the things that matter. So you have to be direct to get your point across. In the corporate world, it's different. And that directness, I received feedback which made me aware that I was too direct. In some instances, it's perfect. That is exactly the communication style that is preferred. But in the day to day, when you have to work with teams across the organization, people who are not within your hierarchy per se, being that direct kind of almost paints you as little less human. And so the feedback that I received was when you start conversations, when you start meetings, a little bit of lighter talk, asking people about how their weekends were, right? Or talking about, hey, how's your morning going? Or on a Friday, most of the calls begin with, thank goodness it's Friday or a happy Friday, right? For me, it's not happy Friday. I am more of a happy Monday. Yay, I'm glad to be at work. Like, where is all this energy? I missed you guys over the weekend. Let's get to work. But that was feedback I received. And when I thought more about it, as I said at the start of the conversation, relationships are important to me. So how do you build relationship? It's true some of the small talk, right? Especially in the COVID era, and now that we were all, many of us still work from home, how do you build a relationship with someone who you're only seeing on the screen? Part of taking that feedback, working on it, and then realizing that I'm very curious about the people on the screen really helped. It helped me change my communication style to, yeah, it doesn't have to be all that direct all that time. There is a time and a place for that. And finding the human elements, just connecting with people one on one. I have a pet, or I have a 15-year-old, or I like to garden. These are all great conversation starters. And what I found was people remember, much to my surprise, little things if they can identify with you, and that makes the relationship become a lot more easier. It flows a lot better, and difficult topics can easily be addressed. I enjoy it.
Well, I just realized that we actually did not small talk today, did we? Not wish you happy Friday.
Hey, just talking with you is a happy Friday thing. So I think
Who gave you that feedback?
it was a corporate, one of my first corporate bosses. The feedback from my boss was I was very direct. But there was another instance more recently where the same feedback was actually a huge compliment. I was at a conference and we were listening to a panel, and there were two panelists who had phenomenal things to say, but they were verbose. It struck a note in me. And so, towards the end of the panel, I stood up and I summarized what I said. This is what the two of you were jointly saying, right? And then one of the panelists said, that is very good, clear, direct, summarized. So that feedback was very different. And I think when I took that piece of feedback, it's like, oh, that's a skill. That's very helpful to be able to take different ideas, lots of words being spoken, and then succinctly summarizing it to get to the gist of it very directly. That's a skill many people admire, and it's useful. I've received both types, but
Yeah,
a
and
context, right?
it goes back to you were saying, it's the context. It's in some situations, and depending on whom you're talking to, depending on what you're saying, being more direct is better. It seems like the feedback that you got was related to more of the organization across you and not above you. So not the more senior leaders, but more of the people, because it can be intimidating if individuals who are speaking to a leader that they haven't spoken to very much, they don't know very well, and who gets straight to business. But if you're talking to a senior leader of yours, they're not going to be intimidated
Right.
by you. So then in that case, there are still situations where the small talk is still very, very valuable. But like you said, everything depends on the situation, on the context,
Mhm.
on how much small talk have you already done with that person, or how well do you already know that person? Or do you think that every single meeting should start with small talk?
I don't think every meeting should start with small talk, be not advisable. But definitely some small icebreakers are good. Icebreakers are needed. And also, if you have recurring meetings, I love the idea of small talk for recurring meetings. Because if it's a recurring meeting and you have to go every week and you have to sit through an hour long discussion that is really deep, focused, those meetings, oh my God, lighten them up a little bit, right? It's not a bunch of robots who are just sitting there. Behind every robot that's showing up on the screen, there are so many emotions. And if you're not able to recognize and harness some of those emotions, how do you get work done? Right? Recognizing the humans beyond the titles, right? That plays a big role. So, no, definitely sometimes you need enough small talk.
Yeah, because you were talking about listening for emotions at the beginning
Mhm.
of our conversation. And would this be then during the small talk phase where you listen to the emotions?
You can definitely look out for emotions, especially if you're on a Zoom call. This is a tired person. This is a frustrated person.
Mm.
This voice is getting to a point where it's probably better to stop talking, right? We all have the ability to recognize those emotions. Whether we act accordingly to manage that situation and respect the emotion in the other person, that is a different story. That is where self discipline comes in. Am I self aware enough that even after I've recognized this emotion, am I quickly changing my behavior? Or am I going in the same direction that I was? I've seen a lot of examples of where it's a train wreck. Like everyone's giving very strong clue and cues of how they're all feeling, but the speaker continues. That's, I think we've all lived through similar examples of that kind.
It doesn't contribute to buy-in
No,
or engagement in that
correct,
case,
correct.
or memory retention, positive
Yes,
memory, certainly not positive memory. There could be a memory of being upset and frustrated, but not something positive. And you mentioned that you're very outspoken, right? You naturally like that. But you also have been talking about context and how important that is. So, how do you decide? Because you also mentioned a couple situations where you find another carrier for that idea, or you simply decide maybe this is not the right time or the right space or the right person to speak up. What are some other things that you account for nowadays when you decide if you should speak up in a situation? Like, how has that changed for you in terms of how much you speak up?
I think maturity in my own career has been a big part of giving me that lens to better decide when and where I speak up. Right. Earlier in my career, I would just speak up because it needed to be said. It is the right thing. This is the logical thing. Right. You just speak up. What I have learned is to gauge who my audience is better. And I will tell you, I'm not perfect at this. Everything that I am saying, when I reflect on it and I try to act on it, I do it better. But that doesn't mean I have perfected it by any means. The things I think about and I learn from them and I try to apply them in my life. And where I find I also experiment a lot. Just in the day to day, I try this, do I try that? What works, what doesn't? Sometimes I find things work, and if they work, I try to use it more often. If they don't work, I don't use it more often. But definitely, as I've matured in my career, as I've gained more experience, I also have, and I shared this with you before too, is I've started to speak less, listen more. And so when I speak, I am consciously trying to make sure that the words that I am using or whatever I'm saying is actually relevant, meaningful. It adds to this conversation or it gives it a different dimension. So I know a lot of the times women are told to say something to make sure that you validate why you're at that table. One thing that I have stopped doing is I don't do that. If I have something to add, I will add. When I say something, I try to make it matter, I try to make it count. If not, I probably gain more by listening.
This is what you're doing now as a leader you're listening more. When you have to say something that's going to add value, you do. What was your strategy early on, or what would you recommend is the strategy around that for people more at the beginning of their careers? Does it change, or would you do anything differently?
I would. As I said, I did not really take any communication classes. I know in the business schools they do teach effective communication skills and strategies. I think my advice to most young people would be, no matter what you're studying, whether you're going to be a doctor, engineer, AI specialist, even if you're going into a very deeply technical field, learning how to communicate effectively is a skill that everyone can learn. And communication always sits on top of a lot of emotions. So, initially, if you can tactically pick up skills that help you communicate clearly, better, more effectively, eventually your life will give you the experiences where your emotions will naturally learn how to apply that effective communication filter. They will come together. Because if you look at most of people that we admire, I admire the Obamas, both of them, the way they speak, the way they talk about deep topics, they talk about important topics, the way they communicate, the way they use their words, that's impactful, right? You talk about, and it's not just the podium based talk, you talk about Martin Luther King and his speeches and the way he talked about it. I come from India. Gandhiji was the father of our nation in India, and the way he talked to a very different crowd, but he knew how to use his words. So I think learning how to communicate effectively should be something that's something I'm going to encourage my son. Although I think it's going to have the same effect that my mother's words had on me.
Ignore it for a few decades, and then he'll like, my mom was so wise. Now I finally understand what she meant.
Yeah. Communication is such an important skill, and we are not taught that. How you modulate your voice, how you hold your emotions, where you hold your emotions, and where it is important to bring your emotions. I think a lot of that can be learned.
Absolutely. It can be learned. That's a great tip there for those in technical careers or any career starting out. Just take the time. That's the one thing that we all need as humans. We communicate, and why not study it and learn it and use it to our advantage, since it is an
Yeah.
instrument, since it is a tool and it has power.
Yes, absolutely.
Has being outspoken overall helped you or detracted in your career?
It's helped me. Helped me. And as I said, I've never really held back. I've always been outspoken. I never, like, I was that one kid who always had her hand up. As I left India, came to the US, realized the value of being outspoken, of being able to clearly say what I want. It just makes it easier for everyone to know, where does this person stand. I think career maturity, being in different environments, has taught me to appreciate the power of these words. So now you have to apply more strategic thinking around how, when, where are you outspoken? Where does it matter? I shared with you before too is there are so many amazing women that I have met who are phenomenal at what they do. They are the carriers, the bearers of entire companies, if you will, right? Take pride in being outspoken. But where has that really lifted them up? And as I started thinking more about, that's the realization I had is the women that I see rising to the top definitely have mastered that art of, where do I speak up? How do I speak up? She was amazing and she was so easy to work with. And then some of my other colleagues actually shared with me, yeah, and you've never seen her behind closed doors with senior executives. Oh my gosh. Okay. So it wasn't the niceness, that the niceness was reserved for all of us who were far junior to her. But where she needed to speak up with her peers among her seniors, she brought that game on, right? That was another learning lesson. Like, where do you speak up? Do not hesitate to speak up where you need to speak up. And you'll know that.
If someone had to choose earlier in their career, maybe they haven't studied communication, are they better off speaking up and being outspoken, even if they're not sure exactly how to communicate in the most diplomatic way and make those choices around when and where to speak up? Are they better staying quiet or still being outspoken when they still haven't acquired those skills?
My preference is to be outspoken. Early on in your career, the rest of your career left, do not hesitate to experiment. It's better to say than to hold it back. Because if you try saying 10 times, it is very likely that at least 2 times someone's going to give you some kind of feedback. And if you are able to take that feedback and act on it, you learn to refine your style. But staying quiet and not speaking up, the damage you do to yourself and your self worth, that's not worth it. Staying quiet is not worth it. So, my advice is better be outspoken. You will get some slaps on the wrist, see it for what it is, but you're probably also going to likely find mentors who can help you refine your style. That beyond all of this, you have to realize the power of communication.
When you choose to stay silent, you don't get a lot of feedback. You don't get nuanced feedback. The only feedback you get, if at all, is you're quiet. But the
You're
reality is,
quiet.
you talked about damage. The damage is invisible because no one sees you. You're less likely to get mentors because nobody sees you, nobody notices you. But if you are outspoken and you mess up a lot, you'll get feedback.
You'll
People
get
will
it.
notice you. People will
Mm-hmm.
notice what's behind those words that maybe you didn't say it, but the intention there, the energy there, the passion is there, and
Yes.
people will pick up on all these other qualities and give you feedback on how to correct the communication, just like you had, which gives you allows you the opportunity, several opportunities to experiment and improve quickly, rather than when you're in the quiet land,
Mhm.
you'll never evolve. It just takes too long to evolve, and no one's going to pay attention to you. Nobody's going to dedicate time and
No.
energy to give you feedback because there's nothing to give feedback on.
One of the things that made me decide to leave academia was this observation that a lot of the senior women leaders that I was seeing in my day to day academic life never spoke up. For never spoke up for junior colleagues, for other women, and I did not like it. It didn't give me comfort. I'm talking about one institute where I saw that and I did not like it, but definitely it left a mark on me. If you don't speak up, you damage yourself, but you also harm others. Where you know you've got something to add, you know you've got a perspective, you know that you're bringing in information that is relevant, needed, you recognize it's needed, but you still don't speak up. That is just, in my books, that is not pardonable.
Absolutely. Words are your best friend and your worst enemy. It depends on how you use it. You talked about how context matters of how you use your words, how you use your communication. That's why it's so important to study the communication skills, no matter what you do, because of the impact of how you use those words. And you also talked about sometimes you don't necessarily need to own the whole thing, the whole communication. You can give your idea, you can communicate your idea to someone else and have them voice it if they are the more appropriate individual for that. You talked about being direct and how it's great in some situations, but maybe not as great in others where maybe chit chat and having more informal conversations to humanize the people and the conversation is helpful, especially in recurring meetings, and being able to capture the emotions and listen to the people's emotions through great listening skills. Communication sits on top of emotions, and also choosing outspoken, especially in your career, because you'll get more feedback, you'll get more input, you can experiment, trial and error, and you will get better over time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Indrani. It was wonderful to have you here, share your career around communication with us. And
Thank you, Una. It's been a pleasure being here, and I hope words can inspire a few aspiring, outspoken women.
love